That evening with my son, Liam, was, without a doubt, the most chaotic yet thrilling night I had ever gone through. My name is Emma, and I want to recount an experience I shared with my son, Liam. It's not easy for me to talk about, but I've kept it bottled up for far too long. Liam is 19 now, but this all began several years back, following the passing of my husband, Mark. Losing Mark was one of the most painful challenges I had ever faced, leaving Liam and me to figure out life without him. Initially, it was incredibly tough. Liam became reserved and withdrawn, spending nearly all his time either shut away in his room or out with his friends. He avoided any conversations about Mark or anything related to his passing, and I chose not to force him into talking. Instead, I concentrated on making our home feel as warm and inviting as possible. I prepared his favorite dishes, left small notes of encouragement on his desk, and did everything I could to ensure he knew I was there for him whenever he felt ready to talk. But for months, he remained distant. Then, one night, while I was tidying up after dinner, Liam unexpectedly walked into the kitchen. His sudden arrival took me by surprise, but I was genuinely happy to see him. It was rare for him to approach me like that. "Do you need a hand, Mom?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. I turned to him, caught off guard by his offer. "Sure, you can dry the dishes," I replied, handing him a towel. We worked together in silence for a while, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I felt a small wave of relief. It was a rare moment, him willingly choosing to spend time with me. Hoping to spark a conversation, I asked, "How was school today?" He answered without looking up, "It was fine." That was it. I decided not to push him for more. "If you ever want to talk, I'm always here," I added gently, stealing a quick glance at him. He simply nodded, but remained silent. Over the next few weeks, I noticed subtle changes in his behavior. Liam started hanging around me more, sitting beside me in the living room while I watched television or lending a hand with small tasks around the house. He even began opening up, telling me about his classes and discussing his plans for college. For the first time in a long while, I felt a flicker of hope, like we were finally reclaiming some semblance of normalcy. But then, one night, something happened that made me question everything. That evening, we had dinner together. Liam had prepared the meal himself, a simple pasta dish he had learned from a friend. As we ate, he suddenly looked at me and said, "You're incredible, Mom." I chuckled lightly, brushing off the compliment. "Thanks, Liam. That really means a lot," I replied, keeping my tone casual. But his expression remained serious, and the intensity in his gaze made my stomach twist. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice soft but cautious. He quickly shook his head. "Nothing. I just wanted to thank you for everything." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. The moment felt strangely significant, but I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. He was just being kind, right? The chaotic night hadn't happened yet, but I now realize this was the moment that set everything in motion. After that dinner, things started shifting. Liam began hovering around me more, always finding excuses to sit closer to me on the couch or linger in the kitchen while I cooked. Initially, I thought it was sweet. I reassured myself that he was simply trying to reconnect after all the time we had spent mourning separately. But then, There were the glances his eyes would linger on me longer than usual, and his compliments became more frequent and oddly personal. "You look really nice today, Mom," he said one morning while I was at the sink washing dishes. "Thanks, sweetheart," I replied, trying to keep my response lighthearted. But something about the way he said it, the way he looked at me, left me feeling uneasy. One night, we were sitting on the couch, watching a movie Liam had picked it. A comedy we had both seen countless times before. About halfway through, I noticed he was sitting unusually close. Our shoulders were nearly touching, and when I shifted slightly, he didn't move away. "You're always so busy," he remarked suddenly, breaking the silence. "You never take time for yourself." I smiled faintly, a bit taken aback. "That's just part of being a mom, Liam. There's always something that needs to be done." He shook his head, his eyes locked on me. "You do too much. You should take a break." His words made my chest tighten. "That's really sweet of you to say," I replied, but I quickly reassured him. "I'm fine, really." That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying that moment over and over in my mind. Was it simply an innocent remark, or was I reading too much into things? What exactly was going on between us? I would soon find out. In the days that followed, I became increasingly aware of how often Liam was making an effort to be near me. If I was in the kitchen, he would show up and strike up a conversation. If I was outside tending to the garden, he would find a reason to join me. His compliments persisted, each one stirring more discomfort within me. And if I was being honest with myself, I began to notice my own actions too. "You make this house feel alive," he told me one afternoon as I folded laundry. I froze momentarily, unsure of what to say. "Thank you, Liam," I finally responded, forcing a smile, but deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was shifting, and not in a way I felt comfortable with. That lingering unease only grew stronger as time went on. No matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, I had convinced myself that Liam was merely being considerate, perhaps even attempting to bridge the gap that had formed between us following Mark's passing. But it wasn't just the kind words, it was the way he behaved around me, how he always seemed to be nearby, watching me, finding subtle reasons to stay close. And the strangest part was, I hadn't yet understood why I found myself doing the same with him. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen, slicing vegetables for dinner, when I heard Liam enter behind me, his footsteps barely making a sound against the tiled floor. I didn't turn around, focusing on my task, hoping he would just grab something quickly and leave. "Do you need any help, Mom?" he asked. Glancing over my shoulder, I gave him a brief smile. "Sure, you can cut these carrots," I said, nudging the cutting board in his direction. He moved to stand beside me, his actions measured, and began chopping. For a while we worked quietly, and I thought, perhaps, this would just be a simple, peaceful moment, something ordinary. But then he suddenly stopped cutting and turned toward me. "You've done so much for me," he said, his voice low. I glanced up, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, after Dad died, you took care of everything. You didn't have to, but you did," he said, his eyes locked onto mine. A wave of emotion tightened in my chest. "Of course I did, Liam. You're my son. I love you," I responded, keeping my voice as steady as I could. He gave a small nod, but his gaze remained unwavering. "I just don't think I ever said thank you for all of it." "You don't have to thank me," I said quickly, shifting my focus back to the stove. "That's what moms do." He didn't reply, but I could feel his eyes lingering on me. The moment felt too heavy, too charged, and all I wanted was for it to pass. Finally, he picked up the knife and resumed chopping. I exhaled quietly, relieved. That night, after dinner, I curled up on the couch with a book, hoping to lose myself in its pages. Liam entered the living room and, instead of sitting at his usual spot on the far end of the couch, he settled right next to me. "What are you reading?" he asked, leaning in slightly to glance at the cover. "Just a novel," I replied, holding the book up for him to see. "Nothing too thrilling. Can I read it with you?" The request took me by surprise. Liam hadn't shown an interest in reading since he was a child, and I couldn't recall the last time we'd done something like this together. A part of me wanted to say no, to tell him I needed a little time to myself, but another part of me didn't want to push him away. "Sure," I said, shifting slightly to give him more space. He moved in closer, his shoulder lightly pressing against mine as I started reading aloud. At first, it felt like any other shared moment from years ago, before everything became so complicated. But as the minutes stretched on, I became increasingly aware of how near he was, how he was watching me rather than the book. When I reached the end of the chapter, I closed the book and set it aside. "That's enough for tonight," I said, keeping my tone light. "Thanks for reading to me," he murmured. "You're welcome," I replied, standing up and heading toward my room. "Good night, Liam." "Good night, Mom," he said. But there was something in his voice, something I couldn't quite identify. The following morning, when I entered the kitchen, Liam was already there. He had made coffee and set out breakfast, something he hadn't done in years. "Good morning, Mom," he greeted cheerfully. "I made you some coffee." "Thank you, Liam," I said, taking a seat at the table cautiously. He sat across from me, watching as I took a sip. "You work so hard," he said suddenly. "You deserve to be taken care of, too." I swallowed, uncertain how to respond. "That's very sweet of you," I managed after a pause. "But you don't have to do all this for me." "I want to," he said with quiet conviction. After breakfast, I retreated to the garden, hoping some fresh air would help clear my thoughts. The cool breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and I sat on the bench, staring at the neatly trimmed hedges, trying to make sense of everything. I didn't know how long I had been sitting there when I heard footsteps approaching behind me. Turning, I saw Liam walking toward me, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. "Of course," I said, though a small part of me hesitated. He sat down, leaving a small gap between us. We sat in silence, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and distant birdsong. "You've been quiet lately," he finally said. "I just have a lot on my mind," I answered, keeping my eyes on the garden. "Is it about me?" His voice was soft but serious. The question caught me off guard. I hesitated before responding. "Why would you think that?" He shrugged. "I don't know. I just feel like maybe I did something to upset you." "You haven't upset me," I assured him quickly. "I've just been tired." He nodded, but said nothing more. After a few moments, he stood. "I'll leave you alone," he murmured. I watched him walk back inside, guilt twisting in my stomach. He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? So why did I feel this way? In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house felt strange, as if a heavy cloud had settled over us. I tried to act as if everything was normal, cooking, cleaning, sticking to my routine, but something had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I couldn't seem to shake the unease that crept over me whenever Liam was around. He hadn't done anything explicitly wrong, yet his presence carried a weight that felt different. One evening, I deliberately chose to put some space between us. After dinner, I retreated to my room earlier than usual, craving solitude. I curled up with a book, the gentle glow of the bedside lamp creating a cocoon of warmth around me. It felt like a rare escape from the strange tension that had begun to form. A mix of anxiety and anticipation stirred within me whenever I thought about Liam, and for the first time, I acknowledged it. The realization unsettled me because I couldn't bring myself to accept that Liam was my own son. Just as I began to relax, a quiet knock echoed against my door. "Mom?" Liam's voice was low, almost uncertain. I hesitated before responding. "Yes? Can I come in?" I glanced at the clock. It was late, well past the hour he normally went to bed. "Is something wrong?" I asked, sitting up slightly. I just, I wanted to talk," he admitted. I exhaled, closing my book and setting it aside. "Come in." The door creaked as he stepped inside. Something about him looked different. He no longer seemed like the self-assured young man he usually projected. Instead, he resembled the little boy I had once comforted after bad dreams. He lingered near the entrance, as though unsure if he should come closer. "What's on your mind?" I asked, patting the edge of my bed. He moved toward me hesitantly, sitting down with deliberate slowness. For a few moments, he remained silent, staring at the floor. Then, finally, he lifted his gaze to meet mine. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he admitted at last. "Sorry for what?" I asked, my tone careful. "For making you uncomfortable," he answered earnestly. "I know I've been acting differently lately, and I don't want you to think I'm trying to make things awkward between us." I blinked, surprised by his candor. "Liam, I began, but he interrupted me. I just I've been feeling a lot of things, and I don't really know how to handle them, he confessed, his voice catching slightly. But I don't want to hurt you. His words hung heavy between us, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite interpret. I reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Liam, it's okay to feel confused sometimes, I said gently, but you need to remember that I'm your mother, and our relationship has boundaries. He nodded, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I know, I'm sorry, he whispered. I gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze before pulling my hand away. Let's not dwell on it, I said, trying to sound light-hearted. We'll figure this out together. A strange mix of tension and something unspoken lingered between us. The look in his eyes told me this wasn't over, and the way I looked back at him probably conveyed the same. He gave another small nod before rising to his feet. Good night, Mom, he murmured before stepping out of the room. I watched him go, feeling a conflicting blend of relief and sorrow. Acknowledging the tension felt like a step forward, but I couldn't shake the uncertainty about whether things would ever return to normal. One thing, however, was clear to me. This wasn't the last time something like this would happen, and I wasn't wrong. The next time, everything would unfold very differently. The following morning, I woke up feeling more drained than usual. The conversation with Liam had kept me awake, my mind racing with unanswered questions and troubling possibilities. I got up, went through my morning routine, and tried to push aside the lingering unease. Liam seemed different that day, quieter, more withdrawn. He stayed in his room for most of the day, keeping to himself. Part of me wanted to check on him, to see if he was okay, but another part of me felt like I needed to respect his space. That evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, Liam entered. He sank onto the couch in silence, watching me work. The quiet between us felt thick, and I struggled to find the right words. You've been quiet today, I finally said, glancing at him. He shrugged. Just thinking. About anything specific? I asked, keeping my tone casual. About us, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I froze for a split second, his words settling heavily in my mind. What do you mean? I asked carefully. He hesitated, his gaze locking onto mine. I know things have been strange lately, and I don't want it to be like this anymore, he admitted. I nodded slowly, uncertain of how to respond. I don't want that either, I said at last. But we have to figure out how to move forward. A faint smile flickered across his lips. We will, he promised. For a brief moment, a spark of hope flared within me. Maybe we could move past this. Maybe we could rebuild what had begun to fracture. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of something I didn't fully comprehend. Or maybe I did, but I just wasn't ready to face it. The quiet discomfort in the house didn't fade. Liam attempted to act as if everything was normal, but I saw the hesitation in his eyes. The way he paused before speaking, the way he lingered whenever our paths crossed. I wanted to believe his apology had put an end to this, but something inside me whispered that it hadn't. Even though I tried to convince myself otherwise, deep down, I understood it wasn't that simple. Then, one evening, as I lay in bed, aimlessly scrolling through my phone in an effort to relax, it happened again. The house was quiet, with only the faint creaking of the ceiling fan above me breaking the silence. It was late, and I was just beginning to drift off when I heard a soft knock at my bedroom door. "Mom?" Liam's voice was gentle, almost uncertain. I sat up, feeling my heart sink. "Yes? Can I come in?" he asked. I glanced at the clock. It was already well past midnight. "Liam, it's really late," I said, trying to keep my tone firm. "What's wrong?" There was a brief pause before he responded. I just need to talk to you." Something in his voice made me hesitate. Taking a deep breath, I finally said, "Okay, come in." The door creaked open, and Liam stepped inside. He looked uncertain, his hands buried in his pockets as he hovered near the doorway. "What is it, Liam?" I asked, making an effort to keep my voice steady. He hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and the floor. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said the other night," he began, his voice low. "And I feel like I need to be honest with you." My chest tightened. "Honest about what?" I asked carefully. He stepped closer and sat at the edge of the bed. "About how I feel," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I know it's wrong, and I've tried to push it away, but I can't stop thinking about you, Mom." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at him, my mind racing. "Liam, you can't," I started, but he quickly interrupted me. "I know," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "I know it's wrong, but I can't control it. You've been everything to me since Dad passed. You're strong, kind, and you've done so much for me. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." His words hit me like a physical impact. I felt frozen, unable to move or react as his confession lingered in the air. "Liam, you're my son," I finally said, my voice unsteady. "I love you, but not in that way. This has to end." "I know," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. I needed to tell you." I reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Liam, what you're feeling is a result of everything we've been through. It's not real. You're young and you're confused, but this isn't right. We have to work through this together." He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "I know," I said, my heart aching at the sight of him. "But we can't allow this to continue. You're a good person, Liam, and you'll move past this." He wiped his eyes and slowly stood. "Good night, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good night," I replied, watching as he left and closed the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I locked the door and sat on the bed, my hands trembling. I couldn't believe what had just transpired. A wave of guilt and confusion washed over me as I questioned every action that might have led to this moment. I loved Liam with all my heart, but his feelings weren't something I could ignore or dismiss. That night, I barely slept. His words kept echoing in my mind as I struggled to make sense of them. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, a moment of confusion that would pass. But deep down, I wasn't sure. The next morning, Liam was unusually quiet. He barely spoke during breakfast, and when he left for school, I felt an odd mixture of relief and sadness. I spent the day trying to concentrate on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to our conversation. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. When Liam came home that evening, he seemed distant, avoiding eye contact and retreating to his room almost immediately. I wanted to talk to him to make sure he was okay, but I didn't know how to approach the situation without making things worse. Later that night, I sat in the living room, staring at the television without really watching it. The house was silent, and the weight of everything that had happened pressed heavily on me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Liam standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can I sit with you?" he asked. I hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. "Of course." He walked over and sat down on the couch, leaving a small space between us. For a long while we sat in silence, the tension between us almost unbearable. "Mom," he finally said, his voice soft, "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," I assured him quickly. "But we need to establish boundaries, Liam, for both of us." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I understand." I reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "We'll get through this," I said gently, "but you have to trust me." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with emotion. "I do." I gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Then we'll be okay." As I sat there, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could move forward. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The days following our conversation were tense but quiet. Liam kept his distance, and I tried to act as though everything was normal, yet the truth weighed heavily on me. I hoped that by confronting the situation and setting boundaries, we could both begin to move on. But something inside told me that silence alone wouldn't be enough to mend what had been broken. Then, one final night, exhausted from a day spent trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling, I went to bed early. The house was still, and the cool night air drifted gently through my open window. I attempted to let the steady hum of the fan soothe me into slumber, but my thoughts refused to quiet. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I was aware of was being pulled from sleep by the sound of my door slowly creaking open. My heart pounded as I blinked into the darkness, trying to gather my bearings. "Liam?" His voice was barely more than a breath, but there was no mistaking it. I sat up abruptly, reaching for the lamp on my nightstand. As the warm light spread through the room, it revealed Liam hesitating in the doorway, his hands nervously fidgeting at his sides. "Liam," I murmured, my voice still thick with exhaustion and confusion. "What are you doing?" He hesitated before stepping inside, his movements deliberate and slow. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted in a quiet voice. I needed to see you." A tight sensation settled in my chest as I tried to keep my breathing steady. "It's really late," I told him, my tone firmer now. "You need to go back to bed." "I know," he responded, his eyes locking onto mine, but I couldn't stop thinking about everything. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, sitting upright. "Liam, I was thinking about you too," I said gently, "but we've already discussed this." I exhaled slowly before continuing. "I love you, but it's not something we can talk about anymore." His expression flickered between determination and vulnerability as he stepped closer. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice unsteady, "but I can't change the way I feel. You've always been the one who was there for me. The only one who's ever truly cared in a way no one else has." A lump formed in my throat as I struggled to find the right response. "Liam," I said firmly, "I care about you because I'm your mother. That's my role." I forced myself to hold his gaze. "But the way you're feeling, it's not healthy. It isn't right." He remained still for a moment, his shoulders gradually slumping as my words sank in. "I'm sorry," he whispered, unshed tears making his eyes glisten. "I just didn't know how else to tell you." The sight of him like that shattered something inside me, but I forced myself to stay composed. "It's okay to feel confused, Liam," I reassured him, "but this is something you need to work through. I'll be there for you as your mother. Only as your mother." Even as I spoke, the words felt wrong, like I was denying something I wasn't ready to face. I saw the disappointment flicker in his eyes, and I immediately regretted my choice. He gave a slow nod, dropping his gaze to the floor. "I don't want to lose you," he murmured, barely audible. "You won't," I promised. "But we have to move forward, Liam. Both of us." And as the words left my lips, something inside me shifted. A thought surfaced suddenly. What am I doing? Why can't I simply assist my son with whatever he desires? He's my son, after all. It hurt to witness how my words let him down, and I didn't want that anymore. Besides, I actually liked his idea too, in a way. Perhaps it was because I missed Mark so much. After a brief moment of silence, I said, "You know what? Come here, sweetheart," inviting him to sit next to me. He moved toward me, and I could see him starting to open up again, locking eyes with me. I said, as I leaned closer to him, he leaned in too, and then it happened. We kissed each other. It was as if all the built-up tension exploded in that moment. It felt so good that I made sure the kiss deepened. After a minute or two, he pulled back and stopped. It wasn't because he had second thoughts or anything. It was because he started touching me in places only Mark had before, and as you can probably guess, we went even further. I hope you now understand why I referred to that as the wildest yet most thrilling night of my life. It was incredible. Afterward, there was an extended silence. "Are you all right?" he asked, Yes, darling, I responded. For what felt like 10 to 20 minutes, the room remained quiet, with only the soft hum of the fan breaking the stillness. Then Liam turned and headed toward the door. He paused in the doorway, looking back at me. "Good night, Mom," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Good night, Liam," I replied, my heart aching as I watched him leave. "Thank you for everything." "I must express my gratitude, Mom," he remarked as the door clicked shut behind him. I exhaled a shaky breath, the pressure in my chest finally subsiding. I reclined once more, gazing at the ceiling, while the occurrences of the last few weeks replayed in my thoughts. I recognized that we still had a lengthy journey ahead, but for the first time I sensed a glimmer of hope that we could restore our relationship to a healthier state. At last, the tension had broken, and the following morning, Liam was calm yet collected. He sat down with me for breakfast, and although our conversation remained light, I could perceive a change in his attitude. He appeared more relaxed, as if he had finally released some of the burdens he had been shouldering. In the weeks that followed, life began to feel more routine. Liam started to spend more time with his friends, and his attention shifted back to his studies and future aspirations. We did not revisit the events that had transpired. The silent understanding between us was evident. We were both attempting to move forward. One evening, while sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Liam turned to me and said, "Thanks for being patient with me, Mom. I appreciate everything you do for and with me. Thanks for accepting me as I am and supporting me in all areas, even those where moms typically don't help their sons." I looked at him, both surprised and touched by his words. I placed my hand on his arm and replied, "Of course, that's what moms do." He smiled, and for the first time in what seemed like ages, it felt sincere. In that moment, I realized we were going to be okay. I'm still uncertain about what I did. Since then, it has happened a few more times, and on top of that, I enjoy it too. I know I assist Liam a great deal. Maybe it's because we both wish to compensate for the loss of Mark, or perhaps there's another reason. I'm not sure. I felt the need to share this with someone, to hear other people's opinions. Should I stop doing this with Liam, or is it perhaps more normal than I think?